This particular talk, this session was actually only added at the very last minute. There were many questions early on in the week, Monday, Tuesday particularly, questions coming into us that we didn't discuss in a lot of detail about which program should I use, which is the best. And so I think it was Tuesday afternoon, we all had a discussion and we said, we really need to put something in. And so this talk follows that. Perplex, Thermocalc, Theriak-Domino, which is best? Of course, there is zero chance that we're going to be drawn into answering that question. And the reason we're not going to be able to answer that question is that there really isn't an answer. The programs all do different things. Or rather, the programs solve problems somewhat differently. They offer somewhat different user experiences. Maybe one program has certain strengths and another program has certain weaknesses in that area. And so we really can't tell you which is best. And I think the best way for me to illustrate that is that I was looking around at the panel. We've been having discussions after every day's meeting as a panel. And I realized that everybody on the panel at some point in their career had used at least 2 of the programs that are on screen now. I think a great example of that is Doug Tinkham. If you look at sort of Doug's early papers, there's a really influential paper on the role of aluminum and magnesium number and manganese in changing phase equilibrium P-lights, calculated with Thermocalc. If you look at some of the Perplex activity composition or solution models, some of them were coded by Doug Tinkham. Doug Tinkham's currently working on some of the coding aspects of Theriak-Domino. So throughout his career, he's used all 3 of these. And if anything, what we would like you to all get out of this workshop is that there's value in all of these programs. So while I can't directly answer this question, we might be able to answer this. What are some of the key differences between the codes? I should also note that there are other codes available. These are the 3 that perhaps are most well used at the moment within the petrologic community, the metamorphic community. They're the 3 that, as panelists, we've got the most expertise in, but there are other options out there. Okay, so the question that motivates this talk, the question that we've gotten perhaps more than any other question this week, is of sort of this general framework. Which program should I use to model my mafic blue schist, my granulite fascist rock, my melting relations, so on and so forth? And this is a perfectly valid question. We think that it might be better termed, better phrased as, which thermodynamic data set should I use to model my mafic blue schist, so on and so forth? Because it's the thermodynamic data set that really controls what we're going to be able to say about our system. And we'll hear more about the building up an appropriate data set from Jacob later. We've heard about data sets earlier in the week from Pierre. We heard yesterday from Jacob about data sets again. But there are a few kind of key things that we might want to think about in terms of the data set. Do the components considered within a data set allow a reasonable description of our rock's composition? For instance, if our rock is very high sulfur, then we need a data set that will describe that. Are there end members in the data set that outline all of the key phases in the rock? It's a similar related question to the first. And are there solution models, activity composition models for the phases of interest? If the answer to these are no, then it really doesn't matter what program we're using to address our problem, because we'll never really end up with the result that we're looking for. There's a subsidiary question here. Do the calibrations of these solution models or end member data, do they extend to the range of PT conditions that we're interested in? Is there a chance that we might perhaps inappropriately be using calibrations beyond the range at which they were first considered? So if we start with this as our question, then we can say, okay, which of the software that we've talked about, which of them will offer me flexibility with the data set that I can use? And so the first question might be, or the first statement, I want to calculate with the most recent version of the Holland and Powell thermodynamic data set. And this is likely to be the data set that perhaps most people on this call right now would be interested in. And Well, we can do that in Thermocalc, we can do that in Perplex, we can do that in Theriak-Domino. I've put with caution here because particularly the new activity composition models, they can take some time to get coded into these programs. And I've got most experience with Perplex, and I can say that sometimes when these activity composition models initially get coded in, there are bugs and there are errors that can take a little bit of time to iron out. So just be aware of that. Okay, so the next thing we might want to do is say, okay, I want to use the Holland and Powell data set, but I want to use a legacy version of it. I want to use an old version of it. And so Perplex and Theriak-Domino come easily bundled with old versions. Thermocalc typically doesn't. We've put a question mark here. I was discussing this with Dave Waters yesterday, and we decided that a question mark is probably the best solution here. Of course, there are many old versions of Thermocalc floating around with the old thermodynamic data. But as far as we're aware, it's difficult to get the old Holland and Powell data bundled with a new download of Thermocalc. So that maybe sways our decision a little bit. If you want to calculate with the Berman data or the Supercrypt data or the Stick-Rud and Lithgow-Bernoulli data for mantle phase equilibria, we have a little bit less flexibility. Thermocalc is not going to be able to help us solve that problem. Perplex and Theriak-Domino will do. And so there's a differentiator there. If we want to calculate seismic properties, pretty easy to do in Perplex. I've said with caution because if we want to do this, of course, we need data with shear moduli. And so shear moduli have kind of after the event been tacked into some of the Holland and Powell data by Jamie Connolly. And so use a little bit of caution there. I gather that it's possible to do this in Theriak-Domino, but it's not that straightforward. If we want a data set that allows us to calculate complex fluid speciation, I think all of these codes are moving in that direction. They're all at various stages of kind of readiness in that sense. I think there's probably in recent years some interesting work that's come out of calculations with Perplex that allow us to begin to move towards reactive transport models where we're actually treating our fluids in a slightly more sophisticated manner. Then 2 points that we've come back to a few times this week. If you want to be completely insulated from choosing which version of a solution model pairs best with the end member data, Thermocalc's probably the safest bet, because if you download a recent version of Thermocalc, it will only really present you with activity composition models that are compatible with the version of the data set you're looking at. That is not the case for Perplex, and Theriak-Domino is somewhere in the middle. So if you want to be able to make decisions about which models you use, which solution models you use, potentially dubious decisions or decisions that are perhaps inadvisable, then Perplex is the way to go. Of course, it's possible in Perplex to make very good decisions and choose the right solution models, but there's a little bit more work involved in doing that. I say the right solution models, and what I mean there really are solution models that are compatible with the version of the data set that's being used and with each other. If you want to code in your own solution models, well, you could do this in any of the programs. It's a little bit trickier in Thermocalc, but it's possible. It might be inadvisable to mess around in any of the codes, actually, with the solution models too much, because particularly if we're using the Holland and Powell data, the solution models and the data have been considered as a single unit. And so if we code our own models, they may be inconsistent with this, but it's possible. In Perplex, it's really quite easy, especially just for a simple binary or ternary model that can be coded in very easily, and one can then experiment and play and see what that might do to our phase equilibria. Likewise, it's quite easy to take an existing model and change, for instance, interaction energies and see what difference that might make. Okay, if we want to calculate a petrogenetic grid, It's possible in Perplex, although Perplex generally just presents end member data in this case. I would probably advise that Thermocalc is the best place to go for that. And so if we want to calculate some of those beautiful petrogenetic grids that Dave Waters was showing us a few days ago, then Thermocalc is probably the way to go. AFM diagrams can be calculated in all three programs. I don't know whether many people do calculate AFM diagrams with all three programs, but I believe it's possible. And then there's this one. This is what I think most people nowadays are wanting to do. They want to fix a rocks composition and make a PT diagram, a mineral assemblage diagram, or a phase assemblage diagram in PT space or in TX or in PX space. And all three of the programs can do that. Although all three of the programs can do that, as we'll see in a couple of slides' time, the strategy for doing that can be somewhat different between them. If we want to demonstrate data set uncertainties in the diagrams, this is much easier to do with Thermocalc. One could code for Perplex or Theriak-Domino a Monte Carlo simulator that would allow us to get to uncertainties, but it would be quite some work. Or you could calculate the phase diagram in one of these programs and then go back to Thermocalc and look at the uncertainties that it would suggest for parts of the diagram. If you want your system to be buffered by a fluid of constrained composition, then Thermocalc and Perplex, that's very easy to do. Theriak-Domino, it's not strictly easy to do, but as Doug Tinkham will tell you a little bit later, there are workarounds to essentially get you to that place. If you want to do inverse modeling to calculate pressure and temperature and phase compositions, this is kind of baked into the core code of Thermocalc. So that the average P or the average T or the formerly average PT mode of Thermocalc is exactly that. Not possible or available in Perplex. It's not natively available in Theriak-Domino to the best of my knowledge, but the bingo antidote code that Pierre talked about recently, was it yesterday or the day before? Time's escaping me. But that bingo antidote approach, in essence, gets you to the same place of a sort of a coupled forward inverse model that can give you an idea of most appropriate pressure and temperature based on mineral compositions. All three codes have had sort of add-on or helper programs to streamline workflow to add value to the results. I'm not going to go into any details about any of these now, but a quick Google search will show you that all three have been extended beyond the work of the original coders. Okay, now some strategic stuff. I'm not going to go into the details of the strategies that the codes are used. We've already heard that this week, but from a sort of if we take a step back from that and what's the user presented with, if you want to build your diagram line by line so you really understand the outcome, then there really isn't a substitute for doing that methodically in Thermocalc. As a teaching tool, it's wonderful. If we don't have patience and we want the thing to be fully automated with the strengths that come with that, with the weaknesses that come to that, then Perplex and Theriak-Domino and their Gibbs free energy minimizers are the likely solution. Before I move on from this, I want to say that there's a check, just sort of a green check here and a green check here. And I think this deserves a little more thought. Slowly deriving our diagrams by hand, that's a wonderful thing. It leads to better understanding of the phase equilibria. It leads to sort of good understanding of the underlying system. And personally, I find it somewhat therapeutic to sit and do, but maybe that says more about me. But at the same time, fully automating it's great because it allows us to just go and explore. We can give Perplex or Theriak-Domino a rock composition, see what the resultant PT diagram is, then go in and tweak the composition a little bit and see how that would change, or tweak the activity composition models a little bit and see how sensitive the result is to those little changes. That's pretty fast and easy to do with Perplex and Theriak-Domino. So again, I think this gets back to the fact that having experience with 2 or 3 of these codes is beneficial for most people. Okay, how long would you be interacting with the program before you get a diagram? I mean, how long are you physically typing on your keyboard? Could be many hours with Thermocalc. That depends upon the complexity of the diagram you're calculating. It also depends on how experienced you are in the code. The more experienced you are, the faster you get. Perplex, you could set up a simple diagram in a few minutes with the program build. Theriak-Domino, you could also set up a program, a calculation very, very quickly. In Perplex and Theriak-Domino, we set the program up, but then we need to let it run. And so we let it run, and a simple, very, very simple KF MASH type diagram, like I showed earlier in the week, might just take a few seconds in Perplex. A complex system might take many hours. And Theriak-Domino is somewhat comparable. A few minutes for something simple, 1 to 6 hours for something complex, several days for the absolute worst case. I've put a little but not really here. And that's because it might only take a few moments to set up the calculation in, let's go with Perplex, because I've got most experience in that and I'm particularly guilty of this. It doesn't take very long to set up the diagram. It then takes a little bit of time to run the diagram. Because the diagram was so quick to set up, I generally make a mistake when I'm doing it. And so I need to go back and do this again. And so I think, although, yes, in theory, one can generate a diagram very, very quickly, there's often a little bit of iteration required to end up where we really want to be. Can the times of these calculations be reduced? Sure, they can. In Thermocalc, the best way to reduce how long it takes to calculate a diagram is just to get more practice. In Perplex, there are various adaptive refinement strategies that I talked about earlier in the week. And then there's the option of parallelization that I discussed earlier in the week. These can reduce the time it takes to calculate a diagram, but there are potentially drawbacks along the way with that. The easiest way to calculate a fast diagram in Perplex is either work in a simple chemical system or have a very low resolution sort of pseudocompound sampling of that system, which maybe can lead to increased uncertainties. Okay, one of the questions that I've been asked a few times, will my diagram be publication ready without editing in a graphics package? The answer is kind of no for all three programs. All three of them, you're going to need to go in and label fields or change the font sizes or tidy a few things up. In Perplex, you might have much more work than that. But all three of them are going to need a little bit of editing and tidying up. Perplex perhaps the most. That being said, phase equilibria that come out of all three of them can be, how can I put this, petrologically useful, but not publication ready straight out of the packages. So we might have a diagram that comes out of Perplex that we need to, look at clarifying and labeling and making it look cleaner. But even before we do that, we can still make interpretations, valid interpretations for our system of interest. Okay, what else have we got? We've got contouring and mode of proportions or compositions of phases. All three programs can do it with various levels of user interaction or repetitiveness. Theriak-Domino, making pixel maps is much faster and easier than making contour plots. Perplex, this is fairly easy. Thermocalc, it's actually also very easy to produce contour plots, but it's somewhat time consuming and manual. Fractionation of phases out of the system, all three codes can do this. In the case of Perplex, we can introduce a few errors if we're not careful how we do this, but there are some wonderful, let's call them helper codes that leverage the key coding of Perplex to allow us to do much more interesting phase fractionation problems. Theriak-Domino might be the most straightforward way of doing this, or might have the most straightforward strategy for doing this. Okay, what else have we got? Can you unintentionally end up with a metastable phase diagram? In Thermocalc, yes. If you're not careful, it's actually quite easy to end up with a metastable phase diagram. I'll show an example of that in a moment. In Perplex and Theriak-Domino, generally not. It's still possible to do by excluding phases from calculations that perhaps shouldn't be excluded, but that's less likely. It's more likely that we'll end up with a true minimum G phase diagram. Can we explore metastable configurations intentionally if we want to? Yes, in Thermocalc and Theriak-Domino, that's sort of baked into the strategies that'd be fairly easy to do. It's possible to do in Thermocalc, but not really natively. You might ask why somebody might want to do that, but if so, I encourage you to go back and look at some of Dave Patterson's slides from yesterday, where there was talk about multiple possible configurations of phases in a system for looking at overstepping of reactions. Can we easily map or contour free energy or volume or entropy or chemical potential or other things? Yes, in Perplex and Theriak-Domino, it's very easy. In Thermocalc, it is actually, I think, possible, but less easy. In Perplex, for instance, once we have our PT or TX diagram, any of these components, any of these parameters can be contoured extremely easily. Okay, I'm almost done with this. This is something we've talked about a few times this week, and it does matter because we want to know that our result, the quality of our result, doesn't depend upon the program that we use. If the quality of the result depends on the program that we use, then of course we should all use the one that gives the best result. You've seen these two diagrams, the left and the right diagram this week. This was calculated in Thermocalc by me during my PhD. This was calculated in Perplex for the same rock. This was calculated in Theriak-Domino. I don't know by who for the same rock. The results are ostensibly the same, with the exception of the fact that these two diagrams on the right include this equilibria here, where potassium feldspar comes in to the right of this line, to the right of this line. This is absent in the Thermocalc solution. Now, we can't blame Thermocalc for that. This is not Thermocalc's fault. This is user error. This is my mistake. I just forgot to look at that those equilibria in this space. And so that goes back to this question of, might I unintentionally end up with a metastable phase diagram? Yes, this part of this phase diagram is indeed metastable. But I think it's fair to say that all three programs, if given exactly the same input files, exactly the same data, and it asks exactly the same question, can end up with the same diagram. One more, two more slides. Will my diagram be correct? Will it be a good description of my rock? Will I be able to interpret it to solve something important? That's a question that I cannot and will not at this point answer. That's very much up to the user. That's how do we set up the problem? Are we considering the most appropriate bulk composition? Should we be looking at sort of local reactive compositions? What chemical system should we be looking at? How good are the activity composition models? So on and so forth. It's not necessarily the program's fault if the result doesn't help us explain the petrologic evolution of our rock. It's almost certainly the user's fault and the data that we're putting into those programs. And so I was going to leave this at this slide here, but I was encouraged yesterday to add one more. All three programs are still being developed. Thermocalc, Perplex, and Theriak-Domino are still being developed by their original developers. These programs were originally developed by either individuals or small groups of individuals who wanted to solve problems. One of the things about individuals is that they tend to retire at some point. And so one could imagine a scenario where the original programmers of these codes are not working on them in the future. Now, I think we're in safe hands at the moment, and there are teams of people, particularly in the Holland and PAL world, or the PAL and Holland world, who are taking the mantle and running with it. But the long-term evolution of these codes we just don't have any idea about what will happen long term at the moment. And so any investment that we make in learning how to use them will be valuable, will be valid for a long time, but we have no crystal ball. We have no way of knowing what the future, the long-term future of these codes will be, or of any new programs that come along and can solve additional problems. And so I'm going to leave it there. That's just a sort of a high-level overview of the differences between the programs. I really don't want to be drawn into the which is best, because I really don't believe that one is best. They can all solve very similar problems. They're all worth thinking about and spending some time with. And so I will leave it there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a nice one from Matt Cohen. Do you want to say anything about program Gibbs? I suppose you had that caveat at the start of your talk that there are other programs other than the 3 we've considered in this workshop.
Yeah, I'm not particularly well qualified to say much about program Gibbs. Matt's just commented that some tasks like contouring are particularly easy in it. I don't really have much experience or really any experience with it. What I will say is that it has been incredibly important and influential in our development of an understanding of metamorphic petrology. It's another, I probably should have had that disclaimer slide on this final slide as well, and basically said, go and explore everything that's available and see what problems can be solved. Matt, I don't have a huge amount of experience with Gibbs, and so I can't really comment in much more detail. But Matt's just commented on the chat that he was talking with Frank. So this is derived from Frank Spear, and it might be the fastest option for getting to a solution. And so, yeah, I encourage you to go and take a look at that.
I think Frank has it up on the web, and you can contact him and get all the files to download if you're interested in looking at program Gibbs as an alternative. I'm not sure what's available data set wise in it, but yeah.
Speaking for myself, I've used program Gibbs. It's a fantastic program. I'm a little bit out of date using it myself, but I used it for building phase diagrams, doing contouring, and it's terrific. But I'm a little bit out of date myself with that.
There's a question, Emma's just asked a question about how easy it is to convert a data set from Thermocalc, or that was native in Thermocalc, to be used in one of the other programs. That's not, again, Theriak-Domino I'm less familiar with than Perplex. It's not actually that difficult to do in Perplex, and there's a helper code that would allow you to do that. There are also codes in Perplex that would allow you to add and format additional thermodynamic data without too much difficulty.
Yeah, we had another question in the chat here about, do any of the programs have better online support or how-to for first-time users? Which is best for a novice user to try out? And I suppose that's kind of a loaded question, but yeah, we didn't really discuss that. I know you said they've all got their pros and cons, but yeah, any comment on that, Mark?
Yeah, okay. I think maybe Theriak-Domino has got the most cohesive instruction manual, perhaps. The Perplex website has got a section on documentation and tips and workshops and things that have been taught related to Perplex. I encourage everyone to go and take a look at that. The problem with that is a lot of the material on there is outdated. So there's a workshop of mine from 10, 12 years ago, which really isn't all that relevant anymore. There's some more current stuff. Chiara Groppo and colleagues have got some really good information on there, so that there's information there. And likewise, there's information available for Thermocalc. I would say that all of these codes have got a learning curve. I would say that if we go to Thermocalc, if we think about Thermocalc, I think the first phase diagram that anybody calculates is likely to take an awful lot longer than they expected, but the second one won't. And so, yeah, there's a definite time investment for any of them. There are resources available for all of them, and I would say that particularly for Perplex, maybe the best way of learning is to go and have a look at those files that are available on the Perplex website. That's perplex.ethz or ethz.ch, and then look at the user groups and the discussion forums and look back through those. Doug Tinkham, you've just come online. Do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, actually, it was to Emma's question, the last question. You know, I've done a lot of transformation of the Holland Powell data set solution models to Theriak-Domino. It's actually very easy. It's very easy because the format of the Theriak-Domino solution model files is pretty straightforward. You basically look at it and sort of see what it's doing. There's only one complexity, and that complexity is what Thermocalc is doing in the background. So if you look in a Thermocalc data file, solution model file, they have all these make statements. And you'll see now there's, you know, make equilibrium, make disordered, make ordered. So Thermocalc does some stuff in the background when it reads in their solution model files. And, you know, for some of the phases, it strips off the Landau properties at reference state conditions, and, you know, strips off, you know, any Landau or Bragg-Williams ordering contributions as you go up pressure and temperature in some cases. In other cases, it just leaves the ordering contributions at reference conditions, but it strips them off when you go up at elevated QT conditions. So there's a bit of a manual step there where you have to make sure that whatever you do in Theriak-Domino is what Thermocalc is doing in the background that's making new phases. That's really the only complexity to it. The rest of it's pretty straightforward.
A question just popped up. What are the complete parameters that need to be reported to reproduce diagrams in different programs? That's a good question, actually. So if I go to, oh, where did I put it? This. So what did we need to be able to calculate these? We needed the same end member thermodynamic data. And so at the very least, we needed to know, in this case, which version of the Holland and Powell data was being used. We needed the same set of compatible activity composition models or phase solution models for those. As Jacob showed yesterday, just changing the biotype model can have substantial effects, particularly in more complex systems. And then we obviously need to know the bulk composition. If we've got those three things, then in theory, we would be able to generate the same diagram with any of the codes. There was a question about the long-term evolution of the codes and you know, what happens after their originators have retired or have just quit and thought, I don't want to be working on this anymore, which I'm sure will happen to all of us at some point. The answer is I don't know. I think we need to keep in mind that the folks who wrote these programs have already done the community an enormous service in doing so. They've allowed us to address questions that 30 years ago, maybe we wouldn't have even been able to conceive of. And so I would feel dubious about putting the Connellys or Powells or the Capitanis, etc., under pressure to give away the source code. I don't know what the long-term solution is. And I suspect there will be different long-term solutions for each of the programs. Would Doug or Dave Waters, would either of you like to comment on that? I mean, you know, De Capitani and Roger Powell very well.
Well, you know, Cappy is still updating his source code, and, you know, of the three programs, I think Cappy is the most open and amenable because it's actually it's impossible to download the program without downloading the source code. So, you know, Cappy forces the user to download the source code when he downloads his program. So I don't know what the future is there. You know, I think that ultimately it would be good if they can be made open source projects where their source code is put in a repository. You know, the repository owner can keep, you know, some control over that repository, but it puts the software in a position where other people can contribute in a sort of a controlled manner. And, you know, everybody benefits from all of those contributions. And I think that that's probably the, you know, ultimately that would be the best approach in my opinion.
Yeah, and that extends beyond these 3 programs here. I mean, one day Frank Spear will retire, and then what will happen to program Gibbs? And so there's a natural lifetime for any code that's used in our community. The problem is that now our community is so sort of beholden to these software. And so, I mean, I'm sure if you look back at Journal of Metamorphic Geology for the last decade, you won't find a single issue that doesn't have a calculation with one of these 3 programs in it. And so I don't think there's any reason to believe that these 3 programs are going to magically go away. But I do think we need to be aware of the fact that they are the work of small groups of individuals who one day will maybe lose interest or not have the time to be contributing in the way they have previously.